The assassination of Julius Caesar was far more horrifying than you imagine. What you're about to discover isn't just the story of a political murder, but a calculated butchery so intimate and brutal that it would haunt Rome for centuries. The popular imagination has sanitized Caesar's death into something almost noble, a quick political execution by principled senators. But the reality was far more sinister and infinitely more savage. The year was 44 BC, and Rome's streets echoed with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares and citizens debating in the Forum. But on that March morning, the 15th day of the month, a different sound would soon fill the air. Not the roar of a bloodthirsty crowd gathered to witness an execution, but something far worse, the wet, rhythmic sounds of 23 daggers piercing flesh, the gasps of a dying god, and the terrible silence that follows when the unthinkable becomes real. What transpired that day was not merely an assassination, but a ritualistic dismemberment of both a man and the very concept of Roman authority. Before we delve into the horror of that final day, make sure to subscribe to hear more dark tales from history that have been hidden from the public eye. Julius Caesar, in 44 BC, stood at the absolute pinnacle of human power. At 55 years old, he had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey in civil war, and been declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, just 1 month before his death. Contemporary accounts describe him as still vigorous despite his age, a man of striking presence with piercing dark eyes and a tall, lean frame that commanded attention. He walked through Rome not as a mere mortal, but as a living deity, having recently accepted divine honors that placed him among the gods themselves. Women threw themselves at his feet, foreign kings bowed before him, and his mere word could raise armies or topple nations. He had transformed from a brilliant general into something unprecedented in Roman history, a singular authority that threatened to eclipse the Republic itself. Yet beneath this godlike exterior, Caesar suffered from what ancient sources describe as the falling sickness, likely epilepsy, which he desperately concealed from public view. His wife Calpurnia reported increasingly disturbing episodes where he would collapse, foam at the mouth, and speak in tongues that seemed to come from another world. These seizures had grown more frequent in his final months, perhaps triggered by the immense pressure of absolute power or, as some historians suggest, by the gradual poisoning that may have already begun. The man who presented himself as invincible was secretly fighting battles against his own failing body, a vulnerability that would prove prophetic. The transformation from Rome's champion to its potential destroyer had been gradual but unmistakable. Caesar had dissolved centuries of republican tradition with breathtaking speed. He appeared in public wearing the red boots of ancient kings, sat on a golden throne in the Senate, and had his image placed among the gods in temples. Most disturbingly, he had begun treating the Senate itself with open contempt, remaining seated when they approached and dismissing their concerns with a wave of his hand. The very men who had once been his allies now saw in him the specter of monarchy, the one thing Romans feared above all else. What made this transformation particularly chilling was how Caesar seemed to embrace it, as if daring his enemies to act. The conspiracy against Caesar began not with his enemies, but with men he considered friends, even sons. Marcus Junius Brutus, whose mother Servilia had been Caesar's longtime mistress, was perhaps the most painful betrayal. Caesar had showered Brutus with honors, appointing him to prestigious positions and treating him with the affection of a father. Some whispered that Brutus might actually be Caesar's biological son, making what was to come a form of patricide. Yet Brutus descended from the founder of the Republic who had expelled the last king, and the weight of that legacy pressed upon him like a physical force. Anonymous notes appeared on his chair in the Senate reading, "You are asleep, Brutus," and "You are not a true Brutus," goading him toward an act that would destroy his soul. Gaius Cassius Longinus, the conspiracy's true architect, harbored a different kind of hatred. Caesar had pardoned him after Cassius fought against him in the Civil War, a mercy that festered into resentment rather than gratitude. Ancient sources describe Cassius as lean and hungry-looking, with eyes that burned with barely concealed rage whenever Caesar passed. He worked methodically to recruit conspirators, identifying men with grievances real or imagined, playing on their fears of monarchy and their wounded pride. By February of 44 BC, he had assembled a group of 60 senators, many of whom owed their positions to Caesar's clemency. The conspiracy was so vast that keeping it secret became nearly impossible. Yet Caesar seemed oblivious or, more disturbingly, unconcerned. The warnings came from everywhere, growing more urgent as the Ides of March approached. A soothsayer named Spurina had examined the entrails of sacrificial animals and found them blackened and twisted, organs that spoke of imminent doom. He approached Caesar directly, grabbing his toga and warning him to "beware the Ides of March," a phrase that would echo through history. Caesar's horses, those magnificent beasts that had carried him across the Rubicon, were found weeping actual tears in their stables, refusing food and turning their heads away from their master. His wife Calpurnia woke screaming from nightmares where she held Caesar's bloodied corpse, dreams so vivid she could still feel the warmth of his blood on her hands when she woke. The night before his assassination, strange omens multiplied with terrifying frequency. A little bird carrying a sprig of laurel flew into the hall of Pompey, where the Senate would meet, only to be torn apart by a flock of pursuing birds, its entrails scattered across the very spot where Caesar would die. Thunder rolled across clear skies, and citizens reported seeing ghostly armies fighting in the clouds above Rome. Caesar himself spent that final night at the home of Marcus Lepidus, where during dinner someone posed the question of what death was best. Caesar, barely looking up from his correspondence, replied, "A sudden one," words that would prove grimly prophetic within hours. That final morning, Calpurnia begged Caesar not to attend the Senate session. She fell to her knees, something a Roman matron would never do, clutching at his toga and weeping that the omens were too dire to ignore. She described her dreams in horrifying detail, how she had seen him stabbed repeatedly, his blood forming pools that reflected not his face but a monster's. Caesar wavered, actually agreeing to send Mark Antony to dismiss the Senate in his name. But then Decimus Brutus arrived, one of Caesar's most trusted allies, and secretly one of the leading conspirators. With honeyed words about how cancelling would show weakness and disappoint senators who had important business, Decimus convinced Caesar to ignore his wife's pleas. The betrayal had begun even before Caesar left his house. As Caesar made his way to the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting while the regular Senate house underwent repairs, the crowds pressed in around him. A Greek teacher named Artemidorus had discovered the conspiracy and written down all the names, desperately trying to push through the mob to hand Caesar the scroll. He managed to touch Caesar's hand, screaming, "Read this now alone. It concerns you personally." But Caesar, surrounded by petitioners and sycophants, merely added it to the pile of documents his servants carried, the names of his assassins literally in his grasp, but unread. The conspirators walking alongside him watched this near disaster unfold, hands already moving toward the daggers hidden beneath their togas. Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal supporter and a man of considerable physical strength, had been deliberately delayed outside the Senate house by Trebonius, another conspirator. They engaged Antony in lengthy conversation about trivial matters, keeping him away from Caesar at the crucial moment. Some historians suggest the conspirators feared Antony's military prowess, and loyalty would make him fight to the death for Caesar, turning an assassination into a bloodbath. Others believed they simply wanted Caesar to die alone, abandoned even by his most faithful friend. The isolation of Caesar was complete, surrounded by enemies pretending to be allies. The Senate House hummed with nervous energy as Caesar entered, the senators rising in what appeared to be respect, but was actually preparation for murder. Caesar walked to his golden chair, placed there as another symbol of his unprecedented authority, unaware that it would become his death throne. The conspirators had positioned themselves strategically around the room, some near the exits to prevent escape, others forming a tight circle that would close like a trap. As Caesar settled into his seat, adjusting his toga with the practiced ease of a lifetime in public service, Julius Simba approached with a petition for his exiled brother. This was the signal. Simba grabbed Caesar's toga with both hands, pulling it down from his shoulders in a gesture that was both an insult and a practical move to entangle Caesar's arms. Caesar shouted, "Why, this is violence!" in genuine shock that anyone would dare lay hands on him. But as he tried to rise, Casca struck the first blow, his dagger aimed at Caesar's neck but glancing off his shoulder instead. Caesar, even in his shock, grabbed the blade with his bare hand, blood immediately flowing as the sharp metal cut deep into his palm. He managed to wound Casca with his stylus, the only weapon he carried, fighting back with the desperate strength of a cornered lion. But then, the circle closed. Daggers appeared from beneath togas like fangs from hidden mouths. 23 senators pressing forward in a frenzy of stabbing. The historical accounts describe a scene of absolute chaos, senators accidentally wounding each other in their eagerness to plant their blades in Caesar's flesh. Blood sprayed in arterial fountains, painting the white togas red and making the marble floor treacherously slick. Caesar tried to defend himself, throwing his toga over his head in a final attempt at dignity, but the blades kept coming. Some struck deep into vital organs, others merely grazed skin, but each one represented another friend turned enemy, another betrayal made flesh. The most devastating blow, both physically and emotionally, came when Caesar saw Marcus Brutus among his attackers. According to Suetonius, Caesar had been fighting back until that moment, but when he saw Brutus approaching with a drawn dagger, something broke inside him. The words he spoke, whether in Greek, kai su teknon, meaning, "You too, my child," or simply a gasp of recognition, marked his transformation from fighter to victim. He pulled his toga over his head, no longer resisting, and let the daggers find their marks. Some historians interpret this as Caesar choosing death over living with the knowledge of such complete betrayal. The frenzy of stabbing continued even after Caesar had clearly died. Senators who hadn't managed to land a blow pushed forward to stab the corpse, needing to mark themselves as participants in the tyrannicide. The body fell at the base of Pompey's statue, Caesar's great rival in life, now presiding over his death. Blood pooling around the inscription that celebrated Pompey's victories. The irony was lost on no one, Caesar dying beneath the image of the man he had defeated in civil war, as if Pompey had reached from beyond the grave for final vengeance. The medical examination later would reveal 23 wounds, though only one. A thrust between the ribs that punctured his heart had been immediately fatal. What happened next revealed the true horror of the moment. The assassins stood in a circle around Caesar's corpse, their togas drenched in blood, their faces spattered with gore, breathing heavily from exertion and adrenaline. They had prepared speeches about liberty and the Republic, but when they opened their mouths, no words came. The other senators, those not involved in the conspiracy, fled in terror, sandals slipping on the blood-slicked floor, some vomiting from shock, others pressing themselves against walls as if trying to disappear. The grand political statement the conspirators had planned dissolved into panicked silence as they realized they stood not as heroes but as blood-soaked murderers. For nearly 3 hours, Caesar's body lay abandoned where it fell, senators too frightened to approach, conspirators too stunned to act. Blood continued to seep from the 23 wounds, forming an ever-widening pool that reflected the afternoon sun streaming through the high windows. Flies began to gather, drawn to the warm blood and exposed flesh. The dignity Caesar had tried to preserve by covering his face was undone as his toga fell away, revealing features frozen in an expression of betrayal that witnesses said would haunt them forever. 3 of his slaves finally entered the Senate house, weeping as they lifted their master's mutilated body onto a litter, his arm hanging limp and dripping a trail of blood as they carried him home. The public revelation of Caesar's corpse transformed Rome into a scene of collective madness. Mark Antony, who had been kept from the assassination but not from its aftermath, orchestrated a funeral that would burn the conspiracy's justifications to ash. He displayed Caesar's body in the forum, the 23 wounds clearly visible, each one labeled with the name of the senator who had inflicted it. The bloodied toga, torn and pierced in 23 places, was held up on a pole and rotated slowly so all could see. When Antony read Caesar's will, revealing that he had left gardens to the people and money to every citizen, the crowd's grief transformed into rage. They built a funeral pyre right there in the forum, feeding it with furniture torn from nearby buildings. And when Caesar's body was placed upon it, the smell of burning flesh filled the air. But here is where the historical record becomes strange, almost supernatural. Multiple witnesses, including the historian Cassius Dio, who compiled accounts from those present, reported that as Caesar's body burned, a comet appeared in the daylight sky, visible for 7 days. The common people declared it Caesar's soul ascending to join the gods, but the conspirators saw it as an omen of doom. More disturbing were the accounts of what happened to Caesar's assassins in the following months. Cassius reported seeing Caesar's ghost before the Battle of Philippi, standing silent and accusatory at the foot of his bed. Brutus encountered the same apparition, which told him simply, "You will see me at Philippi," where both would die by their own swords rather than face capture. The medical details preserved by Roman historians paint a horrifying picture of Caesar's final moments of consciousness. The first wound to his shoulder would have sent sheets of pain through his body while leaving him fully aware. The second thrust, which caught him in the side, would have punctured his lung, filling it with blood and making each breath a drowning gasp. By the time the killing blow reached his heart, he'd already sustained wounds to his groin, thigh, and back, each one delivered by men he had dined with, laughed with, trusted with his life. Modern forensic analysis suggests he remained conscious for perhaps 30 to 45 seconds after the fatal wound, enough time to recognize every face in the circle of his killers. What makes Caesar's assassination particularly chilling is a detail often omitted from popular accounts. Several ancient sources mention that Caesar had actually received detailed information about the conspiracy the night before. A servant of one of the conspirators had overheard plans and tried to warn Caesar, but was turned away by guards who thought him drunk. Some historians suggest Caesar knew exactly what awaited him in the Senate and chose to walk into it anyway, either from fatalistic acceptance of destiny or a desire to die as a martyr rather than fade as an aging dictator. His comment about sudden death being best takes on new meaning if he orchestrated his own murder by ignoring every warning. The transformation of Caesar's assassination from political necessity to personal butchery can be traced through the pattern of wounds. The first few strikes were calculated, aimed at vital areas by men who had planned carefully. But as blood began to flow and Caesar fell to his knees, something primal took over. The wounds became frenzied, overlapping, some so shallow they barely broke skin, while others plunged so deep they scraped bone. One senator, Gaius Cassius Longinus, reportedly stabbed Caesar in the face, a blow that served no tactical purpose but spoke to a hatred that transcended politics. The 23rd wound, delivered to a man already dead, suggests the killing had become ritual rather than practical. The immediate aftermath revealed the conspirators' complete failure to plan beyond the murder itself. They had assumed Rome would celebrate the death of a tyrant, but instead found themselves trapped in the Senate house as angry crowds gathered outside. When they finally emerged, holding their bloody daggers high and crying, "Liberty!" the people responded with stony silence, followed by growing murmurs of threat. The conspirators had to barricade themselves on the Capitoline Hill, suddenly transformed from liberators to fugitives. Within 2 years, every single one of the assassins would be dead, most by their own hands, as if Caesar's ghost hunted them across the empire. Perhaps most disturbing is what Caesar's death revealed about the nature of political violence and personal betrayal. These were not strangers or enemies who killed him, but men who had shared his table, benefited from his generosity, and called him friend. Decimus Brutus was named in Caesar's will as a secondary heir, meaning Caesar trusted him enough to provide for him after death, even as Decimus planned that very death. The Senate House, meant to be a space of deliberation and governance, became a slaughterhouse where the blood of dictatorship and democracy mixed indistinguishably on the marble floor. The 23 wounds represented not just the failure of a political system, but the complete breakdown of human bonds that should transcend politics. Modern archaeological excavations at the site of Pompey's theatre have uncovered what some believe to be traces of the original floor, with discoloration patterns consistent with massive blood pooling. Whether these stains date to Caesar's assassination or some other violence is impossible to determine, but their presence serves as a physical reminder that this ground once bore witness to one of history's most intimate acts of mass murder. Tour guides report that even today, some visitors claim to feel a coldness in that spot, a chill that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the weight of historical horror. The death of Julius Caesar marked not just the end of a life, but the death of the Roman Republic itself. The conspirators had killed the dictator, but created the conditions for an emperor. Within a generation, Caesar's adopted son Octavian would become Augustus, the first true emperor of Rome, wielding power that made Caesar's dictatorship seem modest by comparison. The Senate, which had murdered to preserve its authority, would become little more than a ceremonial body rubber-stamping imperial decrees. In trying to prevent one man from becoming king, 23 senators had ensured that Rome would be ruled by kings forever after, just under the title of emperor, rather than rex. The final, most chilling aspect of Caesar's death lies in a detail recorded by Nicholas of Damascus, writing just decades after the event. He claimed that during the autopsy performed on Caesar's body, the physicians discovered that many of the wounds showed signs of hesitation marks, small cuts near the fatal thrusts, suggesting that even in their frenzy, the assassins struggled with the physical act of murdering a man they knew. These hesitation marks, if true, transformed the assassination from a bold political statement into something far more human and therefore far more horrible. 23 men standing in a circle, daggers trembling in their hands, forcing themselves to strike down a man whose only crime was achieving the power they themselves had helped him accumulate. As we reflect on the horror of Caesar's final moments, we confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of political violence and personal betrayal. The men who killed Caesar believed they were saving the Republic, but they were actually destroying it. They thought they were heroes, but became symbols of treachery. The 23 wounds they inflicted on Caesar's body would metaphorically bleed through Roman history for centuries, a reminder that some acts of violence, no matter how justified they seem, leave stains that can never be washed clean. Caesar's death poses a question that echoes through history. Were those 23 senators brave patriots who sacrificed their souls to save Rome? Or were they simply 23 frightened men who chose murder over acceptance of change? Perhaps most disturbing of all, if Caesar knew what was coming and walked into that Senate house anyway, did he orchestrate the ultimate manipulation, ensuring his transformation from dictator to god through the very violence meant to destroy him? The blood-soaked marble of the Senate floor that day would never truly be clean again. Rome itself would never be clean again. And the image of 23 daggers rising and falling, wielded by friends against a man who may have seen it coming, remains one of history's most haunting reminders that the greatest horrors often come from those we trust most. Was Caesar's death the necessary surgery to remove a tyrant, or was it the suicide of a republic that murdered its own future in 23 desperate thrusts? If these dark tales from history fascinate you, subscribe now to uncover more brutal truths that have been hidden in the shadows of time.